Well, when you invest in stocks, you own part of that company. When you invest in bonds, you have loaned money to that company. So you might want to have Microsoft in your life by loaning Microsoft money, and they would pay you, oh, let's say 3% a year to borrow money from you. The US government would borrow money from you. But you can't be a shareholder in the US government, but you can in Microsoft. And so your other choice is, instead of loaning money to Microsoft, own Microsoft, so that you get the same return for your share that everybody else does. And that has been, I think, for decades, something like a 26, 27% compound rate of return in that company. So the idea is that with stocks comes extra risk, and with stocks, as with all of these things we're going to compare, you expect a higher rate of return. With individual stocks, sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. But with an index or a portfolio of hundreds or thousands of different companies, the odds of one company having a huge impact on the whole is very, very, very small. But here's the killer. Here's the reason this is such a huge decision. And that is, remember, and we didn't talk about it in the early part of this presentation, so I'm just going to mention it. But for every 0.5% you can figure out, you can find somewhere in your portfolio, for every 0.5%, it converts into about $1 million over a lifetime, depending on how much, of course, you're investing. But if you've got an asset class that historically pays 10%, stocks, and another asset class that pays 5%, bonds, you've got 10 0.5% pieces there, which suggests, and I know it's outlandish, that if you invest in stocks, you're going to probably make $10 million more than you would if you invested in bonds. What does it look like when you really put it to work? Does it look like that is possible, is my question for you, Craig.
Yep. So we're on the same screen, and I'm going to reset the values. We're sticking with the S&P 500, and I'm going to add a 0% stock allocation to my 100% stock allocation. And so you can see I now have two columns here. The one on the leftmost column is a 0% stock, and the right column is 100% stock. I'm going to return to this. I guess I'm going to set up our default scenario, which is 40 years. Starting value is 0. We're going to invest in year 1. We're going to have a 40-year contribution of $5,000 per year. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that's kind of our default for this presentation. So tracing down to the bottom, so I started in 1970, and historically, investing $5,000 per year in all bonds, you come out with $1.4 million. If you were to invest in stocks, the bottom line is $2.6 million, right? And so after this 40-year period, you've almost doubled your money by choosing the riskier investment of 100% stocks compared to bonds. And remember, every $300,000 is an extra million, right? So there's multiple millions of dollars in this one decision alone.
Yeah. And by the way, I think also you will show that this was a particularly good time for bonds because we had inflation. And bonds were paying, in fact, in 1980, and that's in here somewhere. Yeah, there it is, year 11. In 1980, I bought a CD from the Bank of Chicago that paid 16% for 5 years. So that was not what we know today. I'm curious if instead of starting in 1970, what happens if you start in, well, I guess just 1980. Let's just see if that 10 years, what impact that has on that $1.4 million that you have there.
Yep. So I just changed the first sequence year to 1980, kept everything else the same. And the bond portfolio, the bottom number is $769,000. And the stock portfolio is $3.2 million at the end of 2019.
Now we're talking about the $10 million difference, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, this is, and so this is what that I think some people really love this calculator, is because they can look for these kinds of situations where you start in high inflation, end in low inflation, start in low inflation, end in high inflation. You can manipulate this in many different ways, but you can also see what a difference a decade makes to the outcome of your lifetime savings. All right, have we made the point? Have we made the case?
Well,
or is there more?
There's just one more piece.
Oh, okay.
So, we've just showed the extremes, right? And being 100% in bonds or 100% in stocks is not realistic for a lifetime, right? So I wanted to just show what a 50% 50-50 allocation would produce, right? So I just changed the equity and fixed income. And so if I was for these 40 years in a 50-50 allocation, I'm going to go back to, actually, I'm going to stay at 1980 as the first sequence year. You can see compared to a 0% stock allocation, which the bottom number after 40 years in a $200,000 investment returns $769,000. A 50-50 allocation returns 1.6, right? And so the difference here is that there's less volatility, right? But the returns aren't as great. So if you compare 100% stocks versus a 50-50 allocation, you've almost doubled your money there. You're at 3.2 at the end of this 40-year period versus 1.6. But 1.6 is a heck of a lot better than 769,000.
Well, I will just make one comment about what you just said. You said 100% stocks or 100% bonds is probably not. I think you used the word realistic. And here's what we know, that there are a lot of young investors who are refusing to have any money in stocks. They are all in bonds. And I've met lots of elderly people. And at age 78, I now know what an elderly person looks like. But I also know that we don't all invest the same, because there are a lot who are unwilling to take any risk at all. But I also want to be fair and say to those people who say, what about having all stocks all the time, all your life? It is a legitimate thing to do. It may not make sense to the person. Well, like in my case, I had an investment in a company and I had it there for 30 years, and it had done for me what I had hoped it would do for me and the people that we served. And so I decided it's time to sell, and I got out. But I know lots of people that have stayed the course and are still in and doing just fine. So an all stock or mostly stock portfolio is not as unusual as some people may think. It's just scary to a lot of people. Now we're talking about risk, having all your money in one company versus having it in many. And this, by the way, is one of the more difficult things to judge. If we looked at it from the academic viewpoint, what the academics say is that the return of the stock market has been achieved because of about 1 out of 25 companies, and that literally half of the companies that have gone public never made any money in the end. They might have made some money for a while, but they didn't in the end. And it is the other half that has produced the profits. And that if you looked at the 96% of the companies, not in the top 1 out of 25, but you looked at the other 96%, the average return is the same return as risk-free T-bills. So the problem is with one company, you're not likely, or even a handful, you're not likely to do as well as you would in the market. But you, of course, have done an actual study to show some examples of this, and I'd love to see them.
Great. And so we'll start here talking about the Nifty 50. And so I believe you were an advisor in the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, actually, I was a stockbroker from 1966 to January of 1969. That's when I went straight, was in 1969. But yes, I was around when the Nifty 50 was popular. Just like we had a similar thing in the late 90s, and we certainly have a similar thing right now. But go ahead.
So my understanding, and I had to research this because Paul recommended it, was that these were the 50 companies that you could buy and trust to survive no matter the cost. That's how they were sold. Is that right?
Well, they were, in those days, a lot of people believed that the way to invest for the long term was to simply buy stock in a company and literally put it in a safety deposit box. In those days, when I first went into the business, people actually held certificates and put them away. And so there were people who believed, and there still are people who believe, that you buy good companies and just let them be. And they grow as you grow old, they grow bigger. And these are the cream of the crop through the eyes of the people who were evaluating companies for the future at that time. And of course, as you know, they're not all household names anymore, or if they are, they're old household names, not new, not the kind we look up to.
That's right. And so when I look through this list, there were some that I grew up with in my youth. In particular, Sears and Roebuck used to be huge.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, when I was trying to figure out the stock ticker for Sears and Roebuck, it was actually a conglomerate of, I guess basically doesn't exist anymore because it was bought and it's now a conglomerate of a number of other companies.
Yeah.
So that's happened to a number of these companies. Of course, there are some that are still around today, American Express, 3M, McDonald's, Walmart. And so there were some that, were really good investments, but the part of this lesson is that you can't necessarily pick the winners regardless of what the experts are saying.
Yeah, and so how did you look at that in terms of evaluating that? I mean, we know that is generally true, but do you want to show a couple of numbers or?
Yep. So first of all, I have to say that the Merriman Foundation Lifetime Investment Calculator doesn't deal with individual stocks. So I had to figure out, how I could prove it. And I found that Portfolio Visualizer has a back test feature over here on the left-hand side. So I've gone to portfoliovisualizer.com, use the right tool for the job when needed. And so you click back test portfolio, and this allows you to evaluate individual stocks compared against a benchmark. So yes, I am showing somebody else's tool, but I'm here to prove a point. So we're going to set up our same common scenario, right? 40-year investment period, $5,000 per year. You can see that the start year, they don't have as much data as we have it in our allocation back testing. So, S&P 500 goes back. We currently have until 1970 published, and they start at 1985 for individual stock data. So I found a couple of companies, and I wanted to show the performance over the 40-year period from 1986 to 2015. And we're going to set up our same scenario. So $5,000 starting value. We're going to contribute a fixed $5,000 per year. That is not inflation adjusted. We're going to compare that against the Vanguard 500 index investor benchmark. And so this is, as I understand it, one of Vanguard's first funds. And so the chart displays, each of these individual stocks compared to that baseline of the Vanguard 500. The first one we're going to choose is Coca-Cola with stock ticker symbol KO. We're going to choose Xerox, and we're going to